and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share stories about encounters with cryptids where the people aren't quite sure what they came across. The stories today include two that were emailed in by a subscriber. I would like to thank Jacqueline for sharing her stories with me and allowing me to share them on my channel. The stories featured in this episode include the familiar voice of a loved one calling out someone's name, a man seeing a pale figure running through the forest while hunting, and a man who has something hanging around the woods near his home. But first, we start with a story from Mexico where a man saw a strange creature when he was a child. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from Mexico and is one of the two emailed in by Jacqueline, where her friend's father saw an unidentified creature one night in the 1970s. He had traveled to Mexico with his parents who immigrated to the United States in the 1960s. They continued to visit Mexico though while their children were young so they would not lose their culture. Jacqueline and her friend worked together and work at night. Her friend's father would always tell them not to walk around outdoors at night before telling them this story, which took place when he was 8 years old. During the visit where the friend's father had his encounter, he, his younger brother, and a couple of children who lived nearby were playing hide and seek one December evening. They were playing near the town's church where there was a small park, for lack of a better term, the friend's father says, that was surrounded by a garden with trees. Jacqueline points out here that this was common for churches in Latin America because it was part of the culture to make the church the focal point of small towns and life in them. 7 o'clock was fast approaching as the children were playing and darkness was coming along with it. The friend's father and his brother were hiding behind a large water fountain with trees all around it. The fountain also included a life-sized version of a saint that was big enough for the two boys to hide behind with no problem. As they waited to be found, the little brother said he felt weird, like he was being watched. This feeling did nothing to deter the two boys from continuing to hide behind the statue. But the boy looking for them was taking too long to find them, and they were getting ready to leave their hiding spot when the father saw something watching them from behind the trees. He describes the creature he saw as being very pale, very thin, and having long, spindly fingers. This thing did not look like a person. When he and his brother saw this creature, they yelled to the other children that they should leave and ran to one of the boys' homes. While there, completely freaked out by what they saw, they told the boy's mother about the creature. But the father describes the mother's expression as looking a bit unusual after hearing about this thing. She of course looked very concerned, but also as if she was not surprised. She didn't say one way or the other though, but the friend's father believes she may have also seen the thing herself at some point. Not long after they saw this thing, the church announced that they were hosting an outdoor mass/blessing in the park and invited everyone in the small town to attend. The friend's father believes the mother of the boy whose house they ran to that night told the priest about what the children saw. He thinks this because although church celebrations were quite common during that time of year, they normally took place closer to Christmas Day, and this mass was held the second week of December. However, this is purely speculation in retrospect on his part. I don't know what would be more terrifying for children other than seeing an actual monster while outside playing one night, or any other time for that matter. My first impression when hearing the description of this thing was crawler. I'm just glad all the children were able to get away from the area safely. Something that sticks out to me about this one that I've heard before is the reaction of an adult when they are told about a creature that is only supposed to exist in fiction. The boy's mother they told when they went back to the house looked like she wasn't that surprised by what she was hearing. To me, if an adult was hearing about a creature like this for the first time, especially from a group of children who said they saw it, I think their first instinct would be to brush it off as the children's imagination or try to tell them it must have been something else they saw and that they are mistaken. She was concerned, but did not brush it off as children being children. That, coupled with the fact that the church had a ceremony not long after, makes me think either she had seen this thing before, or someone else had and its existence was common knowledge in the town. Whatever the case, I hope this ceremony was enough to drive this thing away from their town, and they had no problems after that. What do you think this creature was? And what do you make of the mother's reaction? The next story also comes from Jacqueline and is her personal experience that happened to her about half an hour north of Sacramento, California, when she and her significant other were visiting his uncle this past February over President's Day weekend, which was a 3-day weekend for them both. The uncle's home sits on 15 acres of land that is surrounded by 200 or so acres of walnut orchards he owns. The orchards border what she describes as a woodland area of sorts that also serves as a protected wildlife area. She and her significant other like to visit his aunt and uncle on weekends and holidays because they love to entertain outdoors and have the land to do just that. Jacqueline's incident happened on Saturday of that weekend at about 5:45 in the evening. She was out for a jog near the edge of the property and the wooded area beyond. She also included pictures of the woodland area in her email I will put up on the screen as I continue her story. After her jog, she decided to explore the wooded area for a bit, which she describes as being very pretty and having a creek running through it. It has an abundance of wildlife that live in the area, which includes deer, ducks, birds, rabbits, and other kinds of animals. However, as beautiful as she describes it, she does admit that it tends to get a little spooky when the sun begins to set, as it starts to grow dark within the trees. She does say that despite this, it is still a generally safe area to walk around in. It was when she noticed some birds perched on a branch with some blossoms, almost aesthetically as she puts it, that things took a turn. She was attempting to take a picture of the birds when she heard the rustling of leaves and foliage. She looked around expecting to see a group of deer running past but didn't see anything and went back to trying to take her picture. That's when she started to get creeped out as her surroundings grew dead quiet. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, no birds, nothing. She decided then it was time to go, as complete silence usually indicates there is a predator nearby, so she began walking back. She knew there were coyotes in the area and there had been bear sightings there in the past couple of years. She does say that while this creeped her out a bit, it didn't fully scare her, as her father is a third-generation almond farmer in Santa Rosa, so wildlife doesn't bother her. However, something would happen then that would really freak her out. As she was walking back to her significant other's uncle's house, she heard a voice call out her name. She recognized the voice as that of her significant other, except it sounded wrong. The voice matched perfectly, but the speech pattern and something about the tone were both off. Her significant other is Russian and moved to the United States at around 19 or 20 years old. He speaks perfect English, but he has an accent. He pronounces his J's as if they are next to a vowel like in his native language, with a zh, sh sound. But the voice that called out her name in that moment pronounced the J regularly without an accent. She knows her significant other cannot do this. That's when she started walking faster and eventually started jogging back to the property. When she got back, she saw a deer standing at the beginning of the wooded area. She says it was a regular buck, but what stood out to her in that moment was how it just stood there rather than running away at the sight of a person like they usually did. She says deer are common in the area, so it was more than likely just a regular deer that just happened to be there. Jacqueline says they visited the property since the incident, but she hasn't gone exploring in the wooded area since she heard her name called out there. When she told her significant other what happened to her, he mentioned that some of his uncle's employees who work on the farm have said that the area is creepy and they do not like working near there. She didn't ask what they meant by it being creepy. She also says that she generally tends to believe that everything has a logical explanation and she tries to explore all possibilities. However, she has no clue what could have been out there that called out her name and mimicked her significant other's voice perfectly. When I emailed Jacqueline to ask if I could use her story in an episode, she followed up with more information about the story and the area where it took place. This was in response to me wondering how the mimic, whatever it was, knew her name and her significant other's voice. She told me they used to go for walks in the wooded area almost every weekend when they first started dating. They would also have picnics in a clearing by the creek. This makes me think this thing probably heard her significant other call out her name, and that's when it picked up both her name and his voice. She also mentions that the deer in the area aren't particularly afraid of people because of the protected wildlife area that the property backs up to. She says that during some of their walks in the wooded area, they had deer come really close to them, within arm's reach. While she found this odd, she remembered what her father told her growing up. Wild animals that aren't afraid of people should be avoided because usually it's an indication they associate people with food, likely from people feeding them, or they are sick and behaving irrationally, being that most animals are innately afraid of people. She also told me that she doesn't believe she is the only one who has experienced something unusual in or near that wooded area, as they were there for a visit recently and saw 2 police cars drive by. This is odd because the area where her significant other's uncle lives is generally quite peaceful, and the police don't usually come out that way unless someone reports something. Well, it turns out that the neighbors had called the police because they heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the wooded area. The husband says they didn't see anything, but when they heard the screams, they decided to leave the area and call the police. He describes the screaming as sounding a bit distorted, so he was unsure if it was actually a woman or a wild animal, a fox or coyote for example, but decided to call the police just in case. Jacqueline doesn't know if the police actually found anything out there though. I'm sure I've said this before, but I've always been fascinated with stories involving mimicry and find them particularly creepy. To hear your name called out by a loved one's voice, knowing full well it can't be them, I don't think unsettling quite covers that. With this story, the stillness and quiet in the area, her name called out by a voice that sounded just like her significant other's but not quite right, and the neighbors hearing a woman screaming that sounded distorted, all make me think this is a cryptid. These details are all clear indications of cryptid activity, and show up repeatedly in stories that involve mimicry. What it is, however, is anyone's guess, as there are several cryptids that display this behavior. But with no physical sighting or description, it's almost impossible to say. As for how the deer factor in, the more I read her story and the more I think about it, I don't think this is some kind of shapeshifter. But then again, anything is possible. I think maybe the deer just happened to be there as she left the area after hearing her name called. But it does seem a little coincidental that it was. Jacqueline does say, though, that it did seem like a normal buck, and she didn't say it was acting weird at all. I always say it's terrible how experiences like these, brought on by unknown creatures, can ruin an activity for someone. Jacqueline really seemed to enjoy going to the wooded area, but was robbed of that with her name being called out by a familiar yet wrong voice. However, I cannot blame her one bit for not wanting to go back out there. I wouldn't either. Whatever this thing is employs the tactics of a cryptid who would try to lure people farther into the woods. Calling out her name, the screaming the neighbors heard, and I even told her the only thing missing is a voice, usually a woman or a child's, calling out for help. I actually wouldn't be surprised if someone eventually hears this, or they have already heard it and just haven't told anyone. In any case, I think she's doing the right thing by staying away from this area of the property. Something definitely seems to be in there. And given what she describes in her story having affected not just her, but the farm workers and the neighbors, I think this is some sort of cryptid. What do you think about Jacqueline's encounter? And what do you think called out her name? The next story comes from Michigan, but this one is not about a dogman. I know this is a shock to most of you, as it seems like all the stories I do that come from Michigan do include a dogman. Instead, today I have a story about a man who took his girlfriend out hunting only to see something bizarre running through the trees. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, only that he lived in the Upper Peninsula at the time. The original poster, or OP, was going hunting and decided to take his girlfriend with him. They arrived and spent a couple of hours sitting and waiting when he went to grab another beer. He says he had to reach over his girlfriend to grab one, and when he came back up, he glanced out the window of the blind they were in to see if there were any deer. Instead, he saw something running through the trees with excruciating speed. He describes what he saw as being tall and lanky, pale, bald, and running faster than anything he had ever seen before. By his estimate, he says it covered about 100 feet in a matter of seconds. He is pretty sure it didn't see him. At least he thinks it didn't. He does say, though, that it looked like it was trying to run behind his hunting blind. So he and his girlfriend got out of there as fast as they could, with him toting his 30-30 the whole way. He doesn't think he could have done much to that thing, however. His girlfriend didn't see the creature at first, but she did eventually get eyes on it as she saw it running across the highway right near the OP's land. He believes it is still stalking his woods. He ends his post by asking what anyone who reads his account thinks this thing is, and says he was leaning towards Skinwalker, but would like to get other opinions about what this creature might be. Based on his description of the creature, I think this was a crawler. However, given his location, you can't dismiss a Wendigo, as their description is very close to a crawler. But just based on how he said it was running through the trees with tremendous speed and didn't exhibit any behaviors typically associated with a Wendigo, I think this could have been a crawler. This seems to be the general consensus in the comments section as well. I just hope it hasn't made his property its home and eventually moves on from the area. There's no telling how or why they choose a place to settle into. Perhaps a good source of food or water is nearby. Maybe they take an interest in the people there. If the latter is the case, not interacting with this thing is the best way to make it lose interest and move on. However, if it decides to interact with you and continues to do so, this might be a different story. What do you think this creature was? And what do you think is the best way to handle the situation if it has indeed made the OP's woods its home? The final story of this episode comes to us from North Carolina, where the original poster keeps experiencing weird goings-on around his home. At the time of his post, he had lived in the home for 3 years, where he immediately started having weird things happen in the woods before it died down, just to start back up again. He does not say where exactly his story takes place. The weird things began happening right after the OP moved into the home, while he was outside at night. He always had the feeling that he was being watched, and after the first few nights of this, he began hearing what sounded like someone calling out for help in the woods around his home. The voice sounded very muffled when he heard it. This would happen a few times and he would shrug it off each time, but then things would take an even weirder turn. One night he was walking the tree line looking for more wood to throw on his fire at about 1 or 2 a.m. and had a 30-30 shell thrown at him. However, he does not own a 30-30. This would continue for a few months before his girlfriend and their children moved in with him. She had some chickens and a pig that, unfortunately, were killed after they got out of their enclosure. She disposed of the bodies by throwing them into the woods. The OP says here he doesn't know why she would do that either. However, after she did, all the weird stuff going on around his home stopped. He no longer felt like he was being watched or had eerie feelings, and no longer heard the voice calling out for help. Nothing else happened. He does not say how long ago this happened before he brings the story up to a month before his post when weird things began happening again. In the time between the first part of the story and the second, he got a new girlfriend and she had since moved in with him. She wakes up early and takes their dogs out before she leaves for work. The OP mentions he leaves at 4:15 a.m., so he estimates it's around 5:30 in the morning when she takes them out. Twice in the 2 months leading up to his posting his story online, his girlfriend has seen something large and pale in the woodline while walking their dogs in the early morning hours. The first time it saw her and it ran away. But the morning of the day he posted his story, she was out with the dogs when one of them, the larger of the two, began barking like crazy at something within the trees. When she looked, she saw the creature. She describes it moving as if scuttling, being larger than a deer and looking like a human running on all fours. When the dogs got a good look at this thing, they took off for the house and his girlfriend was not far behind. She was able to get back inside with the dogs where she got ready for work. She hasn't seen anything since this second encounter, but the OP is wondering what this thing is and what he and his girlfriend can do about it. According to her, this creature was a lot closer to the house in this second sighting than it was when she first saw it. He ends his post by saying he is kind of lost on this and doubts shooting the creature would do any good. He then says any advice or theories are welcome. I believe the OP is dealing with a crawler. The description by the girlfriend only further cements it for me. As for why it's hanging around is anyone's guess. Perhaps when his ex threw the chickens and pig into the woods, the creature took it as an offering. I don't think it's a coincidence the weird happening stopped once this happened. He doesn't say how much time passed between that and when things picked back up, but maybe this creature returned because his ex inadvertently fed it before and it is looking for the same again. This is all just speculation on my part though, given the facts presented in the story. However, if this is true, I would strongly advise against feeding this thing or giving it offerings, because even if it makes it stop coming around for a while, it would eventually keep coming back. Usually, if you ignore these creatures, they lose interest and move on. I would start taking the dogs out at a different time to avoid this thing, even though that could be difficult due to work schedules. I definitely wouldn't let them go outside alone though. Especially after what happened with the chickens and the pig. I'm not saying this thing killed them, but you can't completely disregard the possibility. Another thing he mentions is he doesn't think shooting this thing would do much good, and he is right about that. Every story I've heard where someone shoots at these things, it doesn't faze them at all. The only story I've heard where one was killed by a gun was when a dogman was shot through the eye, and that seemed to be pure luck. With as fast as these creatures move, it would be near impossible to line up that shot and hit it. My best advice would be to ignore this thing, don't interact with it at all, and definitely do not feed it. Hopefully it will lose interest and move on. What do you think this thing is, and what advice would you pass along to the OP about how to deal with it? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.